Long before the age of our present Buddha, before the rise and fall of kingdoms we know today, there existed a world so different that it feels almost like another universe. This was the era of Vipassī, a time when human beings lived for 80,000 years, when their bodies reached heights towering like small giants, and when minds were unburdened by the restlessness that defines our current age. Suffering had not yet grown sharp in the hearts of people. Anger was rare, violence even rarer, and the land itself seemed to breathe in gentle harmony. Forests were lush, rivers clear as polished crystal, and the kingdoms of humanity flourished in a state of quiet prosperity. In that age the city of Bandhumatī shone like a jewel of radiant perfection. Ruled by King Bandhuma, a monarch renowned not simply for power but for generosity and wisdom. His reign was said to be so just that even the winds passing through his city seemed to carry a fragrance of harmony. The people spoke of contentment, the elders rarely knew fear, and the young grew up without the shadow of conflict. Yet within the fabric of this peaceful world, there was a sense of waiting, a subtle, sacred anticipation that had no name. For countless eons, the universe had cycled through ages of light and darkness, and ancient traditions whispered that when virtue ripened and conditions aligned, an awakened one would descend to guide humanity toward a deeper truth. Though no one could yet say it aloud, the signs had already begun to gather. In the skies, unusual constellations shimmered with new brightness, as if celestial beings were preparing a path of light. In the forests surrounding Bandhumatī, wandering sages paused in their meditation and sensed a profound stillness spreading across the land. Even the animals behaved differently. Birds rested quietly at dusk, as if listening to something humans could not yet hear. These were omens recognized only by the wise, hints that the world was ready to receive a being of extraordinary insight, a Buddha who would illuminate the path for countless lives to come. King Bandhuma himself, though a man of rational thinking, could not ignore the growing sense of auspiciousness. His court priests reported dreams of lotus flowers blooming in winter, of gentle rain falling from clear skies, and of distant mountains glowing at night. Traveling merchants told stories of miraculous harvests and lakes appearing where there had once been dry earth. Scholars interpreted these events as blessings marking the arrival of a great soul. The king listened, skeptical yet thoughtful, wondering if destiny was already turning toward his own household. In this golden era, the world was unscarred by the deep despair and conflict of later ages, but even in such prosperity, humanity still faced the fundamental truths of existence. People grew old. Bodies weakened, and families mourned those who passed away after their long lives ended. The sense of harmony did not erase the cyclical nature of suffering, it merely softened its edges. Thus the world, serene though it was, remained incomplete, awaiting someone who could point beyond the temporary pleasures of long life and peace. The universe needed a teacher, one who could open the path of liberation. And so it was in this quiet, glowing age that fate began to move. A presence was nearing, like a flame approaching a waiting wick. The elders who remembered ancient prophecies spoke of a time when a being of incomparable clarity would arise, someone whose vision could penetrate the depths of reality itself. They said this being would be born not out of divine miracle, but through the natural karmic unfolding of a long line of virtue and wisdom. He would be called Vipassī, the one who sees clearly, a name foretold long before his birth. Thus the stage was set. The land of Bandhumatī basked in peace, the hearts of its people were open, and the entire cosmos held its breath as the conditions for an awakened one ripened. Though no one yet knew his face or name, the world was already preparing itself for the arrival of a prince who would one day become the first great Buddha of this cosmic era. The story of Vipassī had not yet begun, but every living being, knowingly or not, stood on the threshold of a transformation that would echo across ages. As the auspicious signs grew stronger across the kingdom of Bandhumatī, Queen Bandhumatī, wife of the great King Bandhuma, began to experience a dream unlike any she had known before. One night, as the moon hung full and gentle in the sky, she dreamt that a radiant white elephant entered her chamber, carrying a lotus of pure gold in its trunk. The animal bowed its head respectfully, touched the lotus to her heart, and then dissolved into a sphere of light that settled gently within her. When she awoke, she felt a calm joy spreading through her entire being, as if the universe itself had whispered a secret into her soul. She told the dream to the king, and immediately the court astrologers were summoned. After long deliberation, consulting ancient texts and star maps, they bowed deeply and announced that the queen would soon bear a child of extraordinary destiny, a child whose birth would mark the turning of a cosmic cycle. Months passed, filled with reverence and celebration, until the day finally arrived. When the queen gave birth, the skies above Bandhumatī glowed with a soft brilliance, though no clouds covered the sun. A gentle rain fell, fragrant and warm, giving nourishment to the land without darkening the day. It was said that lotus flowers bloomed in places where none had grown before, and people across the city felt a sudden surge of peace, as if an invisible veil of sorrow had momentarily lifted. The newborn prince shone with a natural radiance, his body marked by the 32 signs traditionally associated with a great being. His eyes, calm and deep, looked upon the world not with confusion but with a strange, silent clarity, as though he had already lived countless lifetimes. King Bandhuma was filled with profound joy, yet within that joy rested a shadow of uncertainty. The ancient prophecies foretold only two possible destinies for such a child: either he would become a universal monarch who would rule the world with perfect righteousness, or he would renounce the throne entirely and become a fully awakened Buddha. The king's heart leaned fiercely toward the former. He dreamed of a lineage strengthened under the rule of an ideal successor, not a son who would abandon worldly life for solitude and asceticism. Still, he knew the prophecy had to be confirmed. Thus the king ordered a great assembly within the palace. Sages from distant lands, Brahmins renowned for their wisdom, and astrologers trained in the mysteries of the stars gathered to observe the newborn. The hall fell silent as they entered, one by one, to examine the child. They inspected the subtle signs on his palms and feet, the serene shape of his face, the calmness of his breath. Finally, after long consultation, they bowed before the king and spoke with one voice: "Great king, this child possesses every characteristic of a future Buddha. His compassion is immeasurable, his wisdom profound. If he remains in the palace, he will become the greatest of rulers. But if he sees the truth of suffering in the world, he will turn away from power and choose the path of awakening." At these words, a tremor of fear passed through the king's heart. The thought of losing his beloved son to the life of a wandering ascetic was unbearable. He imagined a future with no heir to inherit the throne, no royal bloodline to guide Bandhumatī's prosperity. But he also knew he could not deny the prophecy. Rather than fight destiny, he resolved to shape it. If the child must never witness suffering, then suffering must never come near him. Thus, in an act of both love and desperation, King Bandhuma declared that the prince would be surrounded only by beauty, youth, health, and joy. Any hint of aging, illness, or death would be hidden from him. Any sorrow in the streets would be swept away before his eyes could see it. The king believed that by creating a world without suffering, he could steer his son toward the life of a universal monarch. And so the fate of the future Buddha Vipassī was sealed from the moment of his birth. The palace glittered with celebrations, but beneath the music and laughter, an invisible tension lay coiled. The king's efforts to guard the boy from suffering would not change the nature of the world, nor could they prevent the truth from reaching a mind destined to understand it. Yet for now, the child lay peacefully in his mother's arms, a soft light surrounding him, unaware that the entire universe had already placed its expectations upon his small, luminous life. As Prince Vipassī grew, King Bandhuma carried out his vow with unwavering devotion. The boy would know only beauty, pleasure, and perfection. To fulfill this promise, the king ordered the construction of 3 magnificent palaces, one for each season of the year. They were masterpieces of architecture, designed not merely to house the prince but to shield him from every reminder of the world's impermanence. The first palace was crafted for the heat of summer, its walls shimmering with cool marble and fountains that never ran dry. The second was built for the cold months, warmed by gentle flames that seemed to glow without smoke or fuel. The third was designed for the rains, its intricate corridors echoing with the soothing sound of falling water, filtered and softened so that it touched the air like music rather than storm. In these three palaces, Vipassī spent his childhood surrounded by attendants whose faces were perpetually young and joyful, dancers and musicians whose songs never faltered, and gardens where flowers bloomed in perfect symmetry. No sign of sorrow or aging was permitted within these walls. If a servant grew old or ill, they were politely replaced, leaving the prince with no concept of decline. His life unfolded as one long, seamless celebration of youth and luxury. And yet, despite the beauty around him, the prince's mind was unlike that of other children. While his companions delighted in games, Vipassī often paused to observe the world with a quiet, contemplative gaze. When musicians played, he noticed not only the melody but the silence between the notes. When dancers moved in perfect harmony, he wondered why human beings were driven to seek pleasure so endlessly. His questions were gentle, but they revealed a depth beyond his years. The king, fearful that such introspection might lead his son to question the nature of the world, increased the festivities, thinking that more joy would distract him. Luxurious banquets, elaborate festivals, and processions of entertainers filled the prince's days. The more the king tried to drown Vipassī in pleasure, the more naturally detached the prince seemed to become. He appreciated beauty, but he was never bound by it. He enjoyed music, but it stirred not craving but reflection within him. It was as though his heart recognized that beneath the glittering surface of palace life, there was something hidden, something vast and unanswered. As the prince reached maturity, his wisdom and serenity became the talk of the entire kingdom. People admired his gentle speech, his kindness toward all, and the calmness that seemed to radiate from him. But the king took these qualities not as signs of emerging spiritual greatness, but as potential threats to his desire to see Vipassī become a world-ruling monarch. The sharper the prince's insight grew, the more elaborate the king's efforts became to shield him from the realities of existence. Regardless of the season, the prince was always surrounded by youthful attendants, fragrant gardens, and pleasure free of consequence. The walls of his palaces became as much a cage as a sanctuary, though Vipassī himself remained unaware of his father's fears. He believed the world was as serene and flawless as the palaces around him. Yet even in this carefully crafted paradise, moments of subtle disquiet sometimes revealed themselves. Vipassī noticed that flowers, though beautiful, withered by evening. He watched musicians tire after hours of playing, though they tried to hide it behind smiles. He felt, in the quietest chambers of his heart, that every joy he experienced was accompanied by a faint shadow he could not name. These fleeting hints of impermanence stirred questions for which no one could offer answers, not because they were forbidden, but because no one else had ever thought to ask them. For the first time in his life, the prince felt the stirrings of curiosity about the world beyond the palace gates. The beauty around him was undeniable, yet it felt incomplete, as if it existed only to conceal something deeper, something essential. And so, despite his father's efforts, destiny continued to move with quiet certainty. Vipassī's life of luxury, grand, glittering, and faultlessly arranged, had become the fertile ground in which a powerful longing for truth began to grow. Nothing could stop it, for the seed of awakening had already taken root within him. The palaces that were meant to imprison his mind had instead sharpened his awareness of the world's limitations. Even though he had never seen sorrow, some distant part of him understood that life, as presented to him, was only a single layer of a much greater reality. The time was nearing when the prince would step beyond the walls built to protect him, and when he did, the entire foundation of his existence would tremble. As the years passed, the quiet restlessness within Prince Vipassī grew stronger, like a distant drumbeat calling him toward something unknown. Despite the perfection of his surroundings, he sensed that the world outside the palace walls held truths he had never been allowed to see. One day, unable to ignore that inner pull any longer, he approached King Bandhumatī and gently asked for permission to visit the city. The king's heart tightened, for he remembered the prophecy too clearly. But refusing the prince would only sharpen his curiosity, so he reluctantly agreed, then immediately sent messengers ahead to cleanse the streets of anything that might reveal suffering. The elderly were asked to remain indoors, the sick tended within closed rooms, and all scenes of hardship carefully hidden. By the time the prince's royal chariot approached the city gates, Bandhumatī had transformed into a flawless display of joy, music, and youthful vigor. Yet destiny cannot be outwitted by human effort. As the prince rode along the main streets, admiring the architecture and the cheerful crowds, he noticed a figure his attendants had missed, an old man, thin and bent, stepping slowly with trembling limbs. His hair was white, his skin wrinkled, and his breath labored. Vipassī stared with innocent bewilderment. He had never seen anything like this. Turning to his charioteer, he asked softly, "What has happened to this man?" And so, for the first time in his life, the truth slipped past the guards of the palace. The charioteer explained that aging comes to all beings, that even the strong become weak, the youthful grow old, and no one escapes time. Vipassī listened in silence, shaken by a sorrow he had never known. He contemplated the fate of all beings, and a question arose within him like a whisper: if this awaits everyone, what lasting meaning can pleasure hold? The next outing was arranged even more cautiously. But fate intervened again. As the prince's chariot rolled through a quiet street, he saw a man leaning helplessly against a wall, his face pale with illness. His body shook with fever, his breathing ragged and pained. Vipassī stopped immediately, shocked by the sight, and asked what afflicted him. The attendants, unable to lie in the face of such suffering, admitted that sickness can strike anyone, young or old, rich or poor, and that the body, so celebrated in his palaces, is fragile and unpredictable. The prince felt a tremor inside him, as if the world he knew had begun to crack. If sickness can come without warning, he thought, how can any life built on the body be secure? The king's anxiety grew, but the tide could no longer be stemmed. During a third journey, as the prince rode through a district believed to be safe, he encountered a funeral procession. The mourners walked slowly, carrying a still body wrapped in white cloth. Their faces were heavy with grief. Vipassī, moved by an instinctive reverence, stepped down from his chariot and approached the procession. He asked his charioteer what had happened to the person they were carrying. The answer fell like a stone into a silent lake: the man had died. His body had ceased to move, his breath forever gone. Death, the charioteer explained quietly, comes to all beings. No palace, no wealth, no power can prevent the final letting go. Vipassī stood motionless, the truth echoing through his heart. The inevitability of loss struck him with overwhelming clarity. For the first time, he understood that everything he loved, his parents, his own body, even the luxurious world he lived in, was subject to decay and disappearance. Pleasure, once intoxicating, now seemed fragile, fleeting, and ultimately powerless. But destiny, though it had shown him suffering, also held out a final sign. During a later journey, as he wandered through a peaceful grove, Vipassī saw a lone ascetic seated beneath a tree. The man's robes were simple, his possessions few, yet his face shone with a serenity deeper than any joy the prince had witnessed within the palace walls. His posture was upright, his breathing calm, and his eyes radiated a profound freedom untouched by age, sickness, or fear. Vipassī approached him with respectful curiosity and asked what path he followed. The ascetic answered that he had abandoned worldly pleasures to seek liberation from suffering, striving to understand reality and cultivate inner peace. In that instant, something awakened in the prince, an understanding more profound than anything he had learned from tutors or priests. Here, before him, was proof that a human being could rise above the relentless cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. Not by wealth, not by power, but by wisdom and renunciation. As Vipassī returned to the palace, his heart was no longer uncertain. The four sights had pierced the illusion that had enclosed him since birth. No matter how splendid the palaces, no matter how perfect the pleasures, they could not protect him, or anyone, from the fundamental nature of existence. The prince felt the weight of an immense truth settling into his being. Life as he knew it was a fragile dream, and only by seeking the path beyond suffering could he find real peace. The seed of awakening, long dormant, had now burst open. He knew that a moment of great decision was approaching, one that would change not only his life, but the destiny of the world. As the era of Vipassī Buddha moved toward its natural closing, the world that had once been transformed by his presence began to settle into a new equilibrium shaped by the wisdom he had planted. Although every Buddha arises in a world clouded by ignorance and disappears when the time for his mission is complete, the impact of a Tathagata never fades, it spreads through the fabric of existence like concentric circles on a boundless ocean. In the final period of his life, Vipassī Buddha continued to wander with the serenity of one who had completed his work. His disciples, monks, nuns, nobles, farmers, wandering ascetics, and even celestial beings, followed him everywhere, not out of devotion to a personality but out of reverence for the unshakable freedom he embodied. Wherever he went, the earth itself seemed to respond, forests brightened, cities quieted, conflicts dissolved simply by the presence of the awakened one. His teachings had reshaped not just individuals but entire kingdoms, redirecting their priorities from conquest and expansion toward peace, generosity, and moral discipline. In the final rains retreat of his life, Vipassī Buddha spoke often about impermanence. He reminded his disciples that not even a Buddha remains forever, and that the Dhamma survives only when living beings live it, breathe it, and practice it. He encouraged them not to cling to him, not to make him an object of worship, but to become lamps unto themselves, by cultivating their own wisdom. His final discourses focused on the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, and the inner liberation that arises when craving ceases. These teachings were not new, but his tone carried the gentleness of someone offering the last handful of instructions before leaving on a journey from which he would not return. The monastic community felt the inevitability of his passing, yet he reminded them that grief arises from attachment and that the best way to honor a Buddha is to practice the path he revealed. When the moment of his parinibbana drew near, the natural world responded in ways that defied ordinary comprehension. The winds stopped. The rivers ran softly. Even the devas, whose realms lie far above the human world, descended in vast numbers to witness the final moment of a Buddha whose presence had illuminated the cosmos. Vipassī Buddha lay down in the lion's posture beneath trees that blossomed out of season, their petals falling like silent offerings. His disciples gathered around him, many in tears. Though he urged them once more to remember that all compounded things must dissolve. His final breath was not a dramatic moment but a peaceful exhalation, like a candle flame gently going out in a place where there is no wind. In that moment, the world felt both emptied and uplifted, as though the physical absence of the Buddha made the truth of his teachings shine even more brightly. After his passing, the monastic assembly entered a period of deep contemplation. But instead of collapsing under sorrow, they rose in unity to preserve everything they had heard from him. Senior disciples gathered to recite his teachings, sermons, verses, explanations, stories of awakening, and these were carefully memorized in an oral tradition supported by thousands of monks whose minds were trained in perfect recall. Entire regions of the world adopted the Vipassī-era Dhamma as their guiding moral system. Kings continued to rule with compassion, merchants practiced generosity, and communities organized their lives around the ethical principles he had taught. Over time, great stupas were constructed at sites associated with his life, not as objects of worship, but as markers of remembrance, symbols of the victory of wisdom over ignorance. Even long after his era had passed, the influence of Vipassī Buddha echoed across cosmic time. Other Buddhas of the distant future, Sikhi, Vessabhu, Kakusanda, Kogamana, Kassapa, and finally Gautama, would all arise in worlds shaped, at least subtly, by the foundational principles articulated by their ancient predecessor. The purity of his teachings laid the groundwork for the universal pattern that every Buddha would later rediscover: the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the Law of Dependent Origination. Though each Buddha rediscovers these truths independently, the cosmic memory of earlier Buddhas forms a kind of spiritual heritage, a faint trail of footsteps that makes it possible for future generations to recognize the path when a new Tathagata appears. Vipassī Buddha thus occupies a unique place in the lineage of the 7 Buddhas. He stands not only as a teacher of his time but as a kind of ancestral source of clarity for all future awakened ones. In the end, the legacy of Vipassī Buddha lies not in relics or monuments but in the living current of wisdom that continues to flow through the universe. His life reminds us that awakening is not tied to a particular era, culture, or species. It is a universal possibility wherever beings can observe their experience with honesty and courage. By teaching the Dhamma, he illuminated a principle that transcends the rise and fall of civilizations, that liberation is always available in the present moment, here and now, for anyone willing to see clearly. And even though uncountable eons have passed since his time, the story of Vipassī Buddha still inspires practitioners today to walk the ancient path of mindfulness, compassion, and insight. His presence may have vanished from the world, but the truth he embodied remains timeless, waiting to be rediscovered by every seeker who turns inward to look for the unconditioned.